Thank you very much. Please, may we be seated.
This is the outside broadcast of the Nigerian Television Authority, the NTA, reaching you from the International Conference Center, Abuja. Welcome to the live telecast of the Democracy Day Lecture as part of the activities marking the third anniversary of President Muhammadu Buhari's administration. The lecture to be delivered by a university don who is also the immediate past chairman of the Independent National Electoral Commission, Professor Tahiru Jega, has as its theme peace building and good governance for sustainable development. My name is Dele Atumbi.
Distinguished and honorable members of both the Senate and the House of Representatives here present, the honorable ministers in our midst, the Secretary to the Government of the Federation, the Head of Civil Service of the Federation, the permanent secretaries here present, heads of departments and extra-ministerial departments here present, our directors, other invited guests, members of the diplomatic corps, our royal fathers, traditional rulers, religious leaders here present, top functionaries of the party here present, senior special advisors and assistants of the president here present, distinguished invited guests, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, our dear guest speaker here present, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, we welcome you all to this morning's public lecture as part of events to mark the Democracy Day for the year 2018. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I'll not take any of your time and move on straight to invite the Secretary to the Government of the Federation, who will welcome us all with his welcome address. Please, can we give him a big round of applause? There we go.
Your Excellency, President Muhammadu Buhari, the President of the Senate, Speaker, House of Representatives, members of the Federal Executive Council here present, our distinguished guest speaker, members of the National Assembly, permanent secretaries, heads of parastatals and agencies of government, members of the diplomatic corps, our royal fathers, our spiritual fathers, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, gentlemen of the press. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the 2018 Democracy Day Lecture, organized as part of the series of activities to commemorate the 19th year of an uninterrupted civil rule in our dear country, Nigeria. Democracy is a globally cherished and accepted practice for electing leaders, protecting our inalienable rights and preventing arbitrariness in governance, distribution of wealth and public goods, enthroning good governance, and bringing development to the people. In Nigeria, we have for almost 2 decades experienced 4 consecutive and successful transition of power from one democratic dispensation to another. Most notably, is the fact that we recently
You are watching NTA, Nigerian Television Authority. For more information and news updates, visit our website at www.nta.ng, or you can follow us on Twitter at NTA News Now, or you can like us on Facebook at NTA Network News. Stay connected on our YouTube channel at
the rule of law and genuinely building inclusive institutions that will provide the people with a choice in decision-making processes that affect them. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development emphasized that, I quote, there can be no peace without sustainable development, and no sustainable development without peace, end of quote. Nigeria is similarly a signatory to the Open Government Partnership and has committed 4 key thematic areas, namely promoting fiscal transparency, access to information, anti-corruption and asset for disclosure, citizen engagement, and empowerment. All these thematic areas remain critical ingredients for good governance and sustainable development. Today, we have in our midst, as the 2018 guest speaker, the indefatigable Professor Hahiru Jega. He is an academic of repute, a former national president of the Academic Staff Union of Universities, ASU, former vice chancellor of Bayero University, Kano. He served as a member of the Justice Muhammad Lawal West Electoral Reform Committee and later became the chairman of the Independent National Electoral Commission, INEC. His tenure at INEC supervised 2 elections in 2011 and 2015. The 2015 has been considered a free, fair, and credible election globally. Once again, Mr. President, distinguished President of the Senate, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and members of the National Assembly, members of the Federal Executive Council, members of the Diplomatic Corps, the guest speaker, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you all, and I invite you to relax, sit back, and enjoy the lecture. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. Please can we give the Secretary to the Government of the Federation another big round of applause. Thank you very much.
President Muhammadu Buhari took over the mantle of leadership of the country on May 29, 2015, after defeating the then incumbent president, Dr. Goodluck Ebele Jonathan, in the presidential election, which took place in March 2015.
Excellency, the President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, President Muhammadu Buhari GCFR, the Senate President, distinguished Senator Dr. Abubakar Bukola Saraki, the Chief Justice of the Federation, Justice Walter Samuel Nkanu Onwegen, Your Excellencies, the Governors present, Principal Officers of the National Assembly, distinguished senators and my honorable colleagues, members of the House of Representatives, the SGF, the honorable ministers, the head of service, permanent secretaries, heads of MDS present, the service chief and heads of paramilitary organizations, the guest speaker, undoubtedly one of the heroes of our democracy, and former chairman of INEC, Professor Tahiru Jega, distinguished invited guests, members of the press, ladies and gentlemen. I count it a great privilege for me to stand before you on this auspicious day of marking what the freedom associated with democracy means to us. And I want to particularly thank Mr. President for deciding that we invest this day in celebrating those who made the sacrifice to bring us here and what we've been able to use this opportunity as a nation to achieve. And I believe he'll be marking his third year in office by tomorrow. And as it is said in Hausa, a song from the mouth of the composer is sweeter to listen to. I believe he will be able to tell us and the nation what these 3 years specifically meant to us. As I reflect over what the brief comments I will be making, I've been told that I have 3 minutes. I don't know why 5 that I saw in the program, or why even more. And in case I exceed 3 or 5 minutes, I'm just keeping true to type as being the speaker. Well, but for me, really, today, we have to invest it in the service of democracy, to remind, as I have said ourselves, of what these democratic rights mean to us, to talk about how fragile they are, and to use this day to rebuke tyrants, authoritarian leaders, wherever they may be, and to make a rallying call for peace. If you look at the concept of democracy from the loose definition, but very shrewd, given by Abraham Lincoln, the government of the people, by the people, for the people, it doesn't begin to make sense until you know the essence of this government of the people, which is embedded in the declaration of the American independence. We talk about, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Then you begin to know that the meaning of democracy is just to secure these rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. For some of our citizens who wonder whether they're in a position to invest their liberty in the pursuit of happiness, I want to say that they shouldn't despair, because there's hope for the living. And thankfully, in the course of history, the rich and powerful have always interchanged places with the poor and the vulnerable. So there's hope. There's every reason for every Nigerian to celebrate this democracy. As a matter of fact, in order to secure these rights, The framers of our Constitution allocated governmental powers amongst three co-equal branches of government: the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. And they deliberately make the working of government very, very difficult in order to elicit compromise and consensus. Wherever you find a democracy at work, check it very well. It is consensus and compromise that drives it. Of course, this democracy that we all cherish is very fragile. And as such, we mustn't take it for granted. And that's why I thank the President for deciding that we all come here to remind ourselves of the fragility of democracy. Nowadays, democracies hardly die at the hands of men with guns. What imperils democracies globally is the election of leaders who have dubious allegiance to democratic norms. And there's this timely warning contained in the pages of history. I think it was the Irish orator named John Philpott Curran who penned down these great lines, that it is the common fate of the indolent to see that their rights have become a prey to the active, and that the condition upon which God had given mankind liberty is eternal vigilance, which if he fails to adhere to, servitude instantly becomes the consequence of his crime and the punishment for his guilt. I believe that this statement is true as it was then, as it is today. That in order for us to harness the blessings of freedom, we must pay the price. And any generation that has gone to sleep has awakened to the root shock that the courts and other democratic institutions have been weaponized against it. And as such, they have become subjects instead of citizens, where obeisance to the government is demanded as against the government fearing the people. And that mustn't be the case with our democracy. And for us to ensure that our democracy survives, we have to be eternally vigilant. But let me also talk about tyrants, despots, those who threatened democracy, enemies of open society. As a matter of fact, we don't have to dig deep down moral layers to be able to fetch some moral lessons to warn them. The history is an open rebuke to them. It doesn't matter whether they are dictators who came before Hitler, to dictators like Hitler, Pol Pot, Mao, Stalin, Mussolini, name them, whether they are Muammar Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein. A certain seminal tragedy have ended their lives. And it would be wrong for us to expect that we can do what they did and not see what they saw. As a matter of fact, the beauty of democracy is in forbearance. Those of us who are true Democrats here really will exhibit that in the way and manner in which they deploy institutional priorities with forbearance and with grace. Those are true. And let me round in our national creed, which is peace and unity. A united Nigeria would be a peaceful Nigeria. So I want to end by making this rallying call to all Nigerians, south, west, north, east, across all divides, to unite for the common good in pursuit of our freedoms and in the advancement of our peoples. I believe that nothing is impossible in a united, peaceful, and democratic Nigeria. Happy Democracy Day, and congratulations to all of us.
Thank you very much. Being the Speaker of the House of Representatives, he has a great deal. Can we please give him another big round of applause? Thank you very much. Thank you.
The Speaker House of Representatives, Honorable Yakubu Dogara, took a look at the concept of democracy, pointing out that consensus and compromise drive democracy. He recapped the import of fundamental rights.
Your Excellency, the President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, President Muhammadu Buhari, GCFR, Your Excellency, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Right Honorable Yakubu Dogara, My Lordship Chief Justice of the Federation, Mr. Walter Onoge, Secretary of Government, Mr. Mustafa, my colleagues of the National Assembly, members of the Federal Executive Council, Your Excellency, governors here present, head of the civil service, head of ministries, departments, agencies, diplomatic corps, our royal fathers here, our guest speaker, Professor Jega, members of the press, ladies and gentlemen. Mine will be brief as well. And I think the speaker has spoken very well. We always say between him, me, and the speaker says that in his family, he's the last born. In my family, I'm the firstborn. So the lastborn can say a lot of things that the firstborn cannot say. So I will speak as a firstborn. Your Excellency, distinguished guests, let me first of all congratulate the organizer of this ceremony, Secretary of Government, and through Mr. President, for truly organizing this lecture. It is commendable, and I believe it is being done not only as part of celebrating our Democracy Day, but giving us time to sit down and reflect on where we are in order to chart a course for us as a country. Let me join all Nigerians to celebrate 19 years, as you always say, almost 2 decades of uninterrupted democracy. It is not a mean achievement. It's not a small achievement at all, and we should celebrate it. And we should be proud that we have celebrated. Because unlike all our countries, there are not many countries that have so much diversity, whether ethnic, religious, or so on, have come together as a country with a population of over 170 million to still stay together, to still practice democracy for 19 years. It's a great achievement, and we should be proud that we've been able to do that. I say that because we're always so quick to just look at the negative things and also bring out the faults. I think when we achieve things as a nation, we should be proud of that. Let me, as we do that, also acknowledge those who have made sacrifices. Those who have made sacrifices, ultimate sacrifices for us to be here today. Because we will not be here today if not for those who have made those sacrifices. So at that point as well, we that are here now also have a responsibility to ensure that we also leave a legacy for those who are coming behind. Yesterday, we all celebrated Children's Day. Many young children across Nigeria also are looking that in their lifetime, they will have a democracy they can be proud of. And that is our responsibility. I am hopeful for the future, but as we do that, we should not take our democracy for granted. We must work hard, because as said, it is fragile. It is very fragile. And it belongs on us to ensure that we strengthen it. And we can only strengthen it by beginning to hold on to those values and virtues of democracy. We have chosen that we're going to go by democracy, and we must ensure how difficult it is, because as said by the framers of our Constitution, they are making it difficult. When you have in our Constitution arms of governments that are meant to be checks and balances. By the nature of that constitution alone, it means there are bound to be conflicts. It means there are bound to be disagreements. So it is us that must rise above that to find solutions to those disagreements. And this is the area that I want to continue to appeal to all of us as Nigerians, that we must ensure at all times we think of the interests of this country and find solutions to these challenges. It is only through that that we'll be able to bring development. For our people, our commitment as leaders, we must put Nigeria first and put our personal interests last and ensure that we drive for a government that is there to serve our people. I believe when we do that, we'll continue to strengthen this our democracy. On my own last comment is to say that as we approach the 2019 election, that's why I'm happy to see that the guest speaker is here, who has conducted an election that we're all proud of. The 2019 election cannot be anywhere less in credibility, in acceptability than 2015. We should strive to even do better. Anything less than that, I believe it is not the commission that has failed. I think all of us have not done our part. We must ensure that our 2019 election also is better than 2015, because it has shown that an acceptable election provides the platform for good governance and a stable government. And I hope we will take this responsibility by all of us to work towards that goal. At this note, I as well congratulate the entire Nigerians, and that we should all continue to defend this democracy. And for those of us who are in this position, to ensure that we respect those principal democracies, and the tendency for excesses, we should run away from it, but it is because it is not in the interest of our people. I thank you all. I congratulate Nigerians for this great thing.
Senate President Bukola Saraki there, he pointed out that 19 years of uninterrupted democracy is a great achievement. He cautioned not to take democracy for granted, as it is very fragile.
Two major things come to the fore, which is the role of peace in good governance. So for good governance to continue to prevail, there's importance for peace in our society and our communities. The title for the lecture is Peace Building and Good Governance for Sustainable Development, and is to be presented by no other person, by Professor Attahiru Mahmoud Cheka, former chairman of INEC. Please, can we give him a big round of applause as he comes forth?
Guest lecturer is the one, Professor Attahiru Cheka, was the one that, first of all, for the first time, conducted a monumental election in Nigeria where the opposition party defeated an incumbent government at the federal level.
Your Excellency, Mr. President, Mr. Senate President, Mr. Speaker, members of the National Assembly, members of the Federal Executive Council, my Lord, the Chief Justice, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I stand on the existing protocol. I feel greatly honored with the opportunity to deliver this lecture, and I wish to thank the federal government in particular and the Secretary to the federal government for extending this invitation to me. I wish all my compatriots a happy Democracy Day with best wishes for many happy returns. I know that there are Nigerians who hold the view that there is no cause for such celebration. They are, of course, entitled to their opinions, but I believe that such a perspective is grossly misplaced. We should substitute pessimism with optimism. I believe that we are entitled to this celebration, somewhat akin to the late Chinua Achebe's proverbial lizard that fell off an Iroko tree. For those of you who may have read Things Fall Apart, if you recall, the lizard, when it fell off an Iroko tree, believed that it was entitled to praise itself even if nobody else does. So I think Nigerians have to praise ourselves for how far we have come in the journey towards consolidated democracy. Nigeria's return to civil rule in 1999 and the subsequent sustenance of formal, if not substantive, electoral democracy for close to 20 years, given our past experiences with either colonial rule or authoritarian military rule, is no doubt something to celebrate, especially in a country where, if the truth be told, there is a dearth of things worthy of celebration. But Nigeria has come a long way in the quest to fulfill the aspirations of citizens for democracy. No doubt, given Nigeria's potential, things could have been better, but there is no need crying over spilled milk. I am glad that things are not worse than what they are today. We should just try harder to make things much better than they have been, with sustained, incremental, irreversible positive changes. And this is where the theme of today's lecture becomes pertinent, especially if we pose the theme as a question. How can Nigeria build and attain enduring peace predicated on good democratic governance and sustainable development? Indeed, we are in a celebratory mood, but I believe that we must also use today's occasion for sober reflections on outstanding challenges and on how we can and we must collectively address these challenges. I hope that what this lecture contains contributes in this regard. What I intend to do in this presentation is a broad sweep to explore the connection between or the interconnectedness of three concepts which are contemporarily of paramount importance in discussions about the political economies of countries such as Nigeria, and these are peace building, good, and I add democratic governance, and sustainable development. I begin with a conceptual clarification and a broad situational analysis. Then I zero down on the interconnectedness of these three concepts as they apply to the Nigerian context. And finally, I offer some recommendations for improvement, and I conclude with some brief remarks. I start with the concept of peace building. Peace building is a concept often used in the context of post-war or post-conflict situations to address factors that cause or exacerbate inequality, conflict, and violence. It is aimed at bringing about enduring peace to prevent recurrence of conflicts and violence. It is also about mitigating risk of conflict and preventing a relapse of conflict dynamics where conflict has occurred. Additionally, it is about transforming socioeconomic environmental systems so that they can sustain progress and equitable opportunity for all citizens as a country develops. Peace building, in its conventional usage, is essentially reactive, coming after humanitarian rescue, disaster relief, peacemaking, and peacekeeping. Although peace building is a concept often used in the context of post-Civil War societies, I believe that it is applicable to situations in diverse, conflict-ridden, and conflict-prone societies, such as Nigeria, where perennial conflict, even if comparatively of the low-intensity type, disrupts communities and undermines sustainable development. It also need not be reactive. It can be proactive, and peace building can also be preventive. It can be aimed at bringing about enduring peace, whether there is conflict or no conflict, or it can be used to prevent conflicts from occurring in the first place. Some scholars associated with the United Nations have estimated that globally, more than 1.4 billion people, including half of the world's extremely poor people, live in fragile and conflict-affected settings, with about 244 million on the move in migration or immigration, and 65 million of whom are being forcibly displaced by civil wars or civil strife. By 2030, according to these scholars, this number is expected to almost double by growing to about 82%. Most of these conflicts that cause these disruptions are caused essentially by civil wars and other civil strife. But there are also countries characterized by low-intensity conflicts with devastating consequences. In Nigeria, for example, in the past decade or so, massive destruction of lives, property, and means of livelihood, as well as displacement of people, has occurred, caused either by the Boko Haram insurgency or by the so-called herders, farmers, and other forms of conflict. These have serious implications for conflict resolution, for peace building, and socio-economic development in the affected places, but also in the nation as a whole. So peace building entails three main aspects: creating trust, building processes and the institutions of reconciliation and cooperation, and reviving socio-economic activities for sustained means of livelihood in communities. In this regard, wherever violent conflicts disrupt communities and livelihoods and undermines peaceful coexistence among diverse groups of people, not just in civil wars, the concept of peace building is applicable for return to normalcy and or rebuilding trust and confidence for sustainable mutual coexistence. Now I come to the concept of governance, good governance, or what I prefer to call good democratic governance. I often remind my audience that social science concepts are often very ambiguous and defiant of precise definitions. And the concept of governance, and most especially the popularized notion of good governance, are clear examples of opaqueness and ambiguity of such concepts. So what I have done in this section is that I tried to wade through the waters to separate the chaff from the grains and to utilize what I consider as the best definitions and conceptualizations of governance as separate from bad governance and of good governance, particularly a specific notion of good governance popularized by the World Bank, and what I consider a more broader and a more holistic notion of good governance, and what I also think is even most important for countries such as Nigeria, which is what I call good democratic governance. Governance is often confused with government, but governance is broader than government. It's a broader term than government. And this is in the sense that, as one scholar, Haywood, has identified, it refers to, in its widest sense, the various ways through which social life is coordinated, and in this sense, government can be seen as one of the organizations involved in governance. And in this sense, government is the organizational platform of governance in a polity, just like market is the organizational platform of governance in the private sector sphere. According to another scholar, Schneider, the broadest meaning of governance is the production of social order, collective goods, or problem solving through purposeful political and social intervention, either by authoritative decisions, what he calls hierarchical governance, or the establishment of self-governing arrangements. So governance is broadly a process of piloting or steering the affairs of a polity, and it is conducted through governmental institutions, but also through other platforms beyond just governmental institutions. It is about social interactions, it is about consultations, it is about policy making, but informed by input from a wide range of stakeholders for acceptability and for ease of implementation. Now, on the notion of good governance, it was the World Bank that first popularized the concept of good governance in the 1990s, following the failure of the structural adjustment programs of the 1980s to address economic crisis in Africa and other developing countries. The World Bank defined good governance as, I quote, the traditions and the institutions by which authority in a country is exercised. This includes, 1, the process by which governments are selected, monitored, and replaced. 2, the capacity of government to effectively formulate and implement sound policies. And 3, the respect of citizens and the state for the institutions that govern economic and social interactions among them. The notion of good governance, as it has evolved over time, actually focuses more specifically on the need to make government leaner and to make government more efficient. The World Bank, after the failure of the structural adjustments programs, believed that it is the institutions of governance that had failed, and it was not the economic programs that they had designed and had made countries such as ours to undertake. So they therefore focus on agitations for institutional reforms, particularly governmental institutional reforms, which would make government more efficient, much leaner, and, they said, more effective in the delivery of goods and services, which governance is supposed to deliver. In advancing the case for good governance, of course, many other concepts are used, which I have elaborated in my presentation, but which, for lack of time, I'm not going to address. But in World Bank's conceptualization, good governance is about making smaller and leaner and more cost-effective and efficient public delivery of services. Ironically, and this is where I think it's important to just move beyond good governance with a focus on institutions, this notion of good governance by the World Bank means that governance can be efficient both in democratic and non-democratic contexts. And that is why, for example, for a time, the so-called Asian tigers became very popular because they were able to accelerate economic growth and development in their countries, but at the expense of despotic, authoritarian clamping down of their peoples and undermining the basis of democratic development in their countries. So therefore, in the context of democratization, the key question is, should we focus basically on good governance in terms of making government efficient and leaner, or should we focus more in terms of good governance that address other broader and more holistic issues? And in this regard, there is a recent argument that an alternative broader definition and a more holistic definition of governance is more appropriate in consideration of the development processes of countries such as Nigeria. Two scholars, Rothstein and Theorel in particular, have argued that we must place premium on objective interests of the citizens in the definition of good governance, rather than the narrow interests of the ruling cliques, which was more or less what the World Bank's definition has emphasized on. According to them, the basic norm is impartiality in the exercise of public power. And this is very, very important, because no matter how efficient or lean government is, if there is no impartiality in the exercise of public power, then obviously it will hardly, if ever, be beneficial to the people and the citizens of a country. So while good governance is desirable, especially if broadly defined in the context of what Rothstein and Theorel have said, it is important to actually emphasize on the democratic content of governance. Inclusive participatory governance, responsible and responsive leadership, as well as the impartiality of the institutions that exercise government authority are very, very important in the conceptualization of governance that can be beneficial to all of us. And I argue that failure to recognize the need to infuse good governance with democratic content in terms of consultation, representation, and inclusiveness is responsible not only for the failure of the World Bank's efforts to develop African countries through structural adjustment programs, but are also responsible for many well-meaning efforts of individual governments and the leaders in countries in Africa. So from this premise, I argue that good democratic governance, and not merely good governance, is what is an essential requirement to catalyze peace building and sustainable development. To pursue effective peace building and sustainable development programs, effective planning, sound institutions and structures, as well as all-encompassing partnerships, consultations, and dialogue are necessary. Only good democratic governance can guarantee this. Good democratic governance nurtures participatory, inclusive, responsible, and responsive harnessing of societal resources for efficient and impartial delivery of public goods and services, and are facilitative of economic growth and sustainable development. Contrarily, good governance devoid of democratic content breeds injustice and exclusion, nurtures political instability, and erodes regime legitimacy. And we see this all over Africa. Hence, no doubt, a more useful concept would be that which qualifies good governance with democratic content. Let me move on to the notion of sustainable development. Globally, the failure of successive development programs to address threats to lives, property, and livelihood, or what is generally called human development, especially in the developing world, combined with the effects of climate change, devastating civil wars, gave rise to concerns about sustainable development. The United Nations and its agencies have, since the Rio de Janeiro summit, the so-called Earth Summit in 1992, been in the forefront of promoting and pursuing the agenda for sustainable development. Over time, a consensus has emerged that global development challenges cannot be effectively addressed in silos and by national governments individually acting on their own. Rather, international collaboration, cooperation, and partnerships are most desirable for setting sustainable development goals and the agenda for actualizing them. This led to the commitment to achieve the Millennium Development Goals by 2015, arising from the UN Millennium Summit in 2000, and subsequently the adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in September 2013. Sustainable development can be defined as a process through which societal resources are prudently harnessed and utilized to address the fundamental needs of the present without compromising or undermining those of future generations. It is seen as the best means of addressing global challenges which threaten or undermine human security. Sustainable development and peace building are interconnected. The UNDP has posited that sustainable development and sustaining peace are two sides of the same coin. To elaborate, perpetual conflicts threaten, erode, or undermine capacity to pursue stable development processes. They have been disruptive and they have occasioned tremendous suffering for many globally. They have adversely affected the attainment of the objectives of sustainable development. It is in this context, for example, that the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which focuses on, among other things, the goal of creating peaceful, just, and inclusive societies, recognizes the intricate connection between peace and sustainable development. It is targeted to address major global problems such as accelerated global warming, growing inequalities, poverty, gender-based discrimination, violence and conflicts, and structural flaws of the global economic and financial systems. The principal goal of the 2030 Agenda is said to be, and I quote, shifting the world on a sustainable and resilient path. And obviously, it is not only the world. Many countries, including Nigeria, need to be shifted on the sustainable and resilient path. The three core dimensions of sustainable development, namely the economy, the society, and the environment, are all negatively affected by conflicts. and they need peace to thrive and flourish. As Orebi and others have noted, I quote, without peace, development is not possible, and without development, peace is not durable. And in fact, this is more or less a statement also derived from the 2030 agenda. Peace building contributes to sustainable development in many fundamental ways, and I want to highlight just a few. It improves inclusion of parties in decision-making and policy-making. It adjusts public perspectives toward long-term issues rather than short-term coping mechanisms. It helps us to build confidence amongst all stakeholders, from civil society to government, to donors, and to international organizations. And it helps to restore normalcy and revive mutual trust for sustained livelihood and coexistence. So this is a broad sweep of conceptualization and definition of the key concepts which are addressed in this lecture. Now I turn to a discussion of peace building and good democratic governance for sustainable development in Nigeria. I provide here what I call the Nigerian context and situational analysis. And I begin with a general observation, just to put things in context. Countries that are branded in the literature of democratization as democratic, and Nigeria falls among these countries, at least since 1999. These countries are classified into three: mature democracies, flawed democracies, and hybrid regimes. Countries in the hybrid regime category are often also classified as fragile democracies. And as at least the two previous speakers, the Senate President and the Speaker, have already hinted, Nigeria is a hybrid as well as a fragile democracy. For example, Nigeria is classified by the Economic Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index as fragile, along with 14 other African countries, out of a total of 39 that have been classified as such globally, as can be seen from a table which is in the lecture, which will be circulated if it has not already been circulated. Now, this is because, among other things, Nigeria's electoral democracy, launched in 1999, has for long been lacking in electoral integrity, resulting in bad governance and somewhat undemocratic mode of governance. And it is fragile also because of its ethno-religious diversity, which is characterized by deep fissures and acute fault lines. Lack of electoral integrity, which undermines the legitimacy of elected governments, and also on account of reckless bad governance, which characterized the history of Nigeria for most of its 58 years of independence from colonial rule. Indeed, as a transitional democracy, Nigeria, as Larry Diamond, one of the known scholars of democratic transition, has observed, Nigeria is, and I quote him, haunted by the specter of bad governance. Governance is drenched in corruption, patronage, favoritism, and abuse of power, end of quote. Nigeria isn't only fragile, but it has also been categorized as volatile and potentially explosive. The Fund for Peace 2018 Fragile States Index, for example, has placed Nigeria on category 9 out of 11 categories, and in the category that they call alert, in which there are only 19 countries worldwide, and among which are Liberia and Libya. Additionally, the Mo Ibrahim Index of African Governance 2017 ranks Nigeria number 35 out of 54 African countries with a score of 48.1, which is below the African average of 50.8. Now, while the good news is that Nigeria is witnessing what the index calls increasing improvement since 2007, the bad news is that the rate of increment is only plus 0.38%, basically plus 0.4%. And for a country of Nigeria's potentials, this is certainly something that is worrisome, that should concern us, and that we should look for ways to ameliorate. Also, the Electoral Integrity Project's Year in Elections 2017 report indicates that the Perception of Electoral Integrity Index ranks Nigeria as number 15 out of 47 African countries, which is a moderate classification. And I think a lot of it has to do with the electoral reforms that have occurred since 2007, which really is to say that it is something that has to be sustained, that has to be deeply rooted, and that has to be accelerated. But it is in a moderate category, and there is need to scale up things and move into a good category. Now, I brought out all this in order to show that there is much that is desired in Nigeria with regards to human security, with regards to governance and electoral integrity, and with regard to fragility of our system and its susceptibility to conflicts and a crisis which undermine the framework for sustainable development. Indeed, the prevalence of corruption, as indicated by the Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, further complicates the issue of bad governance by showing a massive hemorrhage of resources which could otherwise have been channeled into meeting citizens' basic needs in human security, but which are otherwise privatized by people who have captured the state and its resources. In the circumstances, given all this that I have said, peace building, good democratic governance, and sustainable development are clearly and undoubtedly desirable objectives to be pursued with vigor, passion, and commitment. Because unless we do that, the chances of progress and development will be remarkably constrained, if not undermined. Now, although Nigeria's situation could be said to be in relative terms characterized by what I mentioned earlier as low-intensity conflicts, in contrast to civil war, these conflicts nonetheless have devastating consequences in terms of not just losses of lives and destructions of property, but in terms of their negative impact on economic growth. One scholar, Culus, has observed that where safety is routinely and casually under threat, it will be impossible to generate lasting improvements in most aspects of people's lives. So I said that we can apply the concept of peace building in Nigeria and link it to the issue of good governance in order to achieve the goals of sustainable development. But it is ironic that this notion of peace building, which has been applied only in the context of civil wars, has to be applied in our own context. But it is very, very important to do so, because I believe that unless we make peace possible, will only create the conditions for further instability and the further undermining of our development potentials. So in this context, I say that good democratic governance is the best framework and should be the foundation for peace building and sustainable development in our country. And that is what Nigeria needs, and that is what we should focus attention on by nurturing and institutionalizing them. To be more specific, for example, peace building is necessary in the Northeast geopolitical zone as normalcy returns, as Boko Haram insurgency is degraded, and as we move into the post-Boko Haram insurgency dispensation. And it is important as well in areas drastically affected by herders-farmers conflicts and other forms of perennial communal and ethno-religious conflicts. And there are a few states that we can mention, from Plateau, Nasarawa, Benue, Kaduna, and Zamfara states. Indeed, peace building is also required in Southeast and South-South geopolitical zones to deal with the agitation for Biafra, the Niger Delta militants, and other forms of militancy. Even more significantly, sustainable development goals and agenda must be combined with peace building for long-term turnaround of these conflict-ridden areas. Sustainable development goals and objectives have to be incorporated and reflected in the three core components of peace building, namely disaster relief, macroeconomic reform, and the post-conflict reintegration. Doing this effectively and efficiently in the current state of affairs in Nigeria, however, would require significant upscaling of good democratic governance in our polity. If truth be told, there is a remarkable deficit of good governance, much less good democratic governance in our country. And the chaos, the inadequacy, the inefficiency, the corruption, inequity, and lack of participation and lack of inclusiveness, which characterize provision of disaster relief in conflict-ridden areas, just to use that example, is very illustrative of this. Lack of a mindset and a framework for good governance or good democratic governance explains why disaster relief provisions are cornered by public officials, or how people in IDP camps are considered as paupers rather than victims of conflict that need to be taken serious care of. So these are serious challenges, and they all go back to the issue of governance and how we have to upscale it for sustainable development, for peace building, and even for deepening and consolidating our democracy. So I want to say that given this, the need to do peace building, the need to have good democratic governance, and the need to accelerate sustainable development in our countries, I make a few recommendations. The first recommendation I make is that Nigeria needs to develop its capacity, institutions and structures and processes of peace building for sustainable development domestically. At the federal level, the only institution that has the legal mandate on peacekeeping, conflict resolution, and so on is the Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution. And its mandate seems very narrow, and its activities seem remarkably constrained. So we need to develop capacity in this regard, and this needs to be done urgently. Nigeria has made substantial contributions, both sub-regionally and continentally, to peacekeeping and peace building in many African countries. But it seems to lack capacity effective means and mechanisms of peace building and conflict resolution domestically. It was good that we did all those things, but we need to remedy the situation domestically and pay a lot of attention to institutions and structures and processes of peace building and conflict resolution in our country. I think this is a matter of urgency that both the National Assembly and the executive branch need to pay attention to. Secondly, state governments should establish conflict resolution and peace-building agencies as a panacea for perennial conflicts and insecurity, especially such as the farmers-herders conflicts and communal disputes and conflicts. It is regrettable that only 2 states in Nigeria have seen it right to establish these agencies. These are Plateau and Kaduna states. All other states really need to pay attention to this because a lot of these issues are localized. And the federal government can only support or provide regulatory framework or provide incentives. The actual implementation would be at the state level. And regrettably, that is where we have the most crisis of governance and the most reckless examples of corruption and impunity in our country. Thirdly, the governance architecture nationally and the processes and the institutions of these need to be remarkably improved upon to effectively drive peace building and sustainable development. In line with the goal of Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, to which Nigeria is a signatory, we must work harder to institutionalize good democratic governance and sustainable development. Government must be transparent, participatory, inclusive, equitable, fair, and just. We need to institutionalize good democratic governance as we deepen our democracy, rather than leave governance to the mercy, the goodwill, the predisposition, or indeed the idiosyncrasies of elected legislative and the executive office holders. 4, governments as both the federal and state levels need to recognize that peace building and sustainable development are indeed 2 sides of the same coin and must be pursued simultaneously. Attention, therefore, has to be focused more on creative and enduring ways of pursuing development programs and projects on a sustainable basis with transparency, with equity and justice, while simultaneously building peace in the conflict-ravaged areas and indeed as a preventive measure in all other areas which are conflict-prone in our country. What can be termed as preventive or proactive peace-building agenda also needs to be developed and deployed, not only, again, in conflict-prone areas, but also in all, not only in our conflict-ridden areas, but also in all conflict-prone areas. 5, the fight against corruption, which is very commendable, has to be intensified in all its ramifications. There are many successes achieved which are commendable, but the magnitude of the problem on the ground is turning these into drops in the ocean. Indeed, it needs to be recognized that corruption has virtually become a way of life in virtually all our public institutions. And I think it is very, very important that we cast such lights upon not just embezzlement, because right now the fight against corruption is focusing on embezzlement and theft. But we need to cast a searchlight beyond embezzlement and theft to what happens in many public institutions, both at the federal and state levels, regarding bribe giving and bribe taking, which is more or less a daily affair. Especially at the middle levels and lower levels, this has become a way of life. Now, I emphasize this point because, Mr. President, many of us who are patriotic and who are passionate about the fight against corruption not only commend you, but wish to treat you, we, as Oliver Twist. You know, the more you do, the more we want to be done, because that's the only way we can get this country out of this cancer of corruption. And that's why I'm pointing out to this aspect of not embezzlement and higher level corruption, but things that are becoming routinized in our public services, both at the state and the federal levels. Indeed, regrettably, many of the chief executives that I have spoken with, and I know only a few, have terrible stories to tell, particularly about the issue of bribe giving and bribe taking when members of the National Assembly pursue so-called committee work and oversight responsibilities. This is well known. Everybody knows it. It's being said, but nothing seems to be done about it. And I wonder what is happening to the intelligence and investigative responsibilities of our security and policing agencies. Some chairmen of committees in the National Assembly have become notorious on this issue of recklessly, with impunity, demanding for bribes. I'm back in the university system. I have heard stories from many vice chancellors about the horrors that they go through on questions of budget and so-called oversight. I am not saying that chief executives are saints, but all we are saying is that we must cast the searchlight so that Nigerians, and particularly public office holders, should have basic common decency and integrity in the ways in which they discharge their responsibilities. Because that's the only way we can make progress in this country. I argue, and this is because of some of the things I have been reading in the newspaper recently, that there is no need to be defensive about reports by organizations such as Transparency International or Human Rights Watch and others when they indict our country. They may embellish or misinterpret some evidence, but the basic reality remains. There are so many things that are going wrong for so long, and these are condemnable, and that we must find ways and means of remedying this. The challenge is to keep addressing these issues with focus and to attain incremental positive changes. And where necessary, generate what I call incontrovertible evidence so as to remove the opportunity of mischief by some of these international organizations. The sixth recommendation I want to make is in the direction of what I call general governance reforms, which I believe are imperative and urgently desirable for our country to improve its profile towards good democratic governance. Reform of the public services, and I should acknowledge that something is already on course and is being done, but it needs to be done more in a more focused manner and to attain goals more quickly. So reform of the public services is necessary, not just for efficient, effective delivery of goods and services, but also for inclusive and impartial discharge of the mandate of public services. And the security architecture as part of public service in general, and the Nigeria police in particular, need urgent and substantial reforms to improve and reposition them to be more effective in protecting lives and property, in safeguarding national security, in enforcing the rule of law, and in dealing decisively with criminal impunity. The rule of law is the foundation of sustainable development, human security, and peace building. The police in particular and the security agencies in general must be repositioned to induce and or compel compliance with the rule of law and to prevent or penalize as appropriate its breaches. Above all, they must demonstrate competence, professionalism, and impartiality in the discharge of their responsibilities. Significantly, the judiciary also needs to reform and improve upon the administration of justice to speedy up the processes and ensure that justice is not willfully or inadvertently denied. Number 7, perceptions may be deceptive, but we seem to be treating such weighty issues with devastating consequences as the so-called herders-farmers conflicts. We must put the right kinds of mechanisms in place in the fight against this at all levels, local and federal. And we must adopt a long-term perspective in doing this. The fire brigade solution, which seems to characterize what we do quite often in this country, and what seems to me is what is happening, very reactive. When there is a crisis, then you mobilize, and if things ebb, then virtually everybody seems to forget about what is going on. So I believe that it's very, very important to consider addressing these issues over the long term, even while we address the underlying causes as well as the immediate causes in the short and the medium term. No matter how passionate and emotive the issues may seem to be, we must only have recourse to the rule of law in protecting fundamental rights and the citizens. And in many of these places, with regards to these conflicts, fundamental constitutional issues of rights are at stake. And we don't seem to be focusing attention on that. We seem to be more focusing attention on the primordial identity of the different participants in the conflict. And I think it's a major error, and we need to remedy that. 8, we need to continue to expand the scope of inclusivity of governance in Nigeria by giving more women and the youth greater roles and responsibilities in the public services and in public offices generally. The giant of Africa, which Nigeria is being called, is lagging far behind in this regard. Looking at the number of women elected representatives or even appointed women, even though we seem to be making progress, but we are far behind many other African countries. And in particular, our so-called youth bulge, because we have one of the highest percentages of youth population in the world. So this so-called youth bulge should and must be seized upon as a demographic asset and appropriately utilized to prevent it from becoming a liability and a formidable security threat. And we no need to re-emphasize that unemployed youth, their minds are no doubt the devil's workshop in conflict generation, in conflict perpetration, and in many other significant respects. So we need to address this issue. We need to do more with regards to youth employment, with regards to youth involvement in the governance processes, and with regards to women participation and involvement in these processes. 9, ultimately, since we are talking about deepening democracy, we are talking about getting out of a classification of a fragile or a hybrid democracy, ultimately, attention has to be focused on strengthening electoral integrity and deepening democracy as a framework for engendering good democratic governance in our country. I'm glad that the President of the Senate has talked a lot about this. In a lecture which I delivered in March under the platform of the Nigerian Institute of Advanced Legal Studies, I have discussed what, in my view, what needs to be done as we move towards the 2019 general elections in terms of improving the integrity of the electoral process. But given what I see on a daily basis in the last few months, obviously, the INEC is confronting remarkable challenges which need to be addressed urgently in order to protect the integrity of the 2019 elections. The first issue of concern and a major challenge is the issue of violence. And there is no better illustration of this than what has happened in many of the recent party congresses. And really, these portend danger. If political parties cannot organize their internal elections peacefully, how can they engage with other parties with civility in the general elections? So it is very, very important that we pay attention to this, because if there is a crisis in the elections, some of these issues are outside of the scope of responsibility of the Electoral Commission. But in the end, it is the Electoral Commission that gets blamed. So it's very, very important we improve our systemic mechanisms of addressing violence and conflicts related to election, and in particular in improving the scope of internal democracy within political parties. We may be running out of time, but we must try harder and do everything possible within the time available to us before the next general election. The second major challenge which I see is, and this is being reported both by domestic and international organizations, is the increasing spate of hate speeches by political actors, by religious and opinion leaders, and obviously this needs to be tamed. And to a large extent, it is these unbridled utterances of opinion leaders, political leaders, religious leaders, that also facilitates the kind of violence we see, whether it is in intra-party politics or in general elections. So this has to be tamed. Again, we must take serious measures and ensure that the rule of law is complied with, because there are many laws against hate speech. So effective prosecution is very, very important to mitigate this challenge. Otherwise, if the intensity continues with the level at which it is now, then obviously it will be a recipe for undermining the integrity of elections in 2019. So more and more democratic, patriotic, well-meaning Nigerians need to speak against hate speech, while government puts its mechanisms in place and make them active in identifying, in prosecuting, and in penalizing those who perpetrate these acts. Thirdly, a big challenge I see is the delay in the passing of the electoral legal framework for the 2015 general elections. From what happened, I don't know whether it was last week in the House of Representatives, it seems some progress is being made. But it is very, very important that we have a good and a much better electoral legal framework in place for the 2015 general elections, for the 2019 general elections than we had in the 2015 general elections. This is very, very important. I kept giving examples of some aspects of the existing legal framework which could have created constitutional crisis if not for God's intervention in 2015. I've given example regarding, for example, the constitutional provision that requires the conduct of runoff presidential elections within 7 days. It's impossible in this country to do that, but that's what the Constitution says. Why is it impossible? By the time the Electoral Commission announces results, it may be 2 days. And then if you take out those 2 days, it means you have 5 days to prepare for the next runoff elections. Meanwhile, after the elections, INEC normally demobilizes. The youth corps are demobilized, the security and police agencies are demobilized, and you cannot remobilize them and get them to the polling units within the remaining 5 days. So in 2015, we had very serious apprehensions in the Election Commission about that constitutional provision, because if, and in a Nigerian context, you can never discount it, if a runoff becomes necessary, we cannot do it within the constitutional provision. So it's very, very important to address this. And of course, there are many other provisions of the Electoral Act which are contradictory, like the issue of internal party democracy. You have a provision, I think 87, that says that party primaries should be conducted on the basis of democratic principles, something to that effect. And then you have Section 31 of the Electoral Act that says that whatever name a party submits to the Electoral Commission cannot be rejected for any reason whatsoever. INEC has a mandate to monitor party congresses, so INEC has a list of those candidates that emerge out of democratic primaries. But political parties have a penchant, hiding under Clause 31, to send to INEC people who have not even participated in party primaries. And I have seen it as chairman of Electoral Commission in 2015. We wanted to be proactive, to say we will reject it. But we were advised by lawyers that if we did that, the Electoral Commission will now be interpreted as being partisan, because we will be said to be doing it to one party and so on. And in Nigerian politics, people are anxious to drag the Electoral Commission into politics. And once that is done, the entire integrity of the commission is undermined. So these issues are very, very important. There are many other issues. Last example I will give is the issue regarding conducting by-elections in the case of death, or even in the case of cross-carpeting. INEC, by law, has to be notified, even if it reads it in the newspapers and even if it knows what has happened, unless the National Assembly has written to it to declare a vacancy, INEC could not conduct a by-election. And there were many cases that we knew before 2015 general election. People who have cross-carpeted, who should have lost their seats by virtue of cross-carpeting. But the leadership of the National Assembly, advertently or inadvertently, refused to write to INEC. I say this because we appeared at our Senate Ethics Committee and provided evidence that a senator had actually cross-carpeted and by the provisions of the law had lost his seat, and that we wanted to be written so that we could organize by-elections to replace that. That letter never came until I left office. That provision is still there. That provision is still there. And if we don't have a revised legal framework, we will continue to carry the baggage of bad laws that can undermine the integrity of our elections. So please, it's very, very important to accelerate this process of having a new, improved legal framework for INEC to be able to do its job, because right now they are tremendously under serious pressure. Again, we should be mindful of a provision of a protocol that we have signed, the ECOWAS protocol, which requires all signatories to ensure that any amendment to the electoral legal framework is concluded at least 6 months before the general election. Ideally, it should be at least 1 year before the general election, because that's how INEC will be able to now put the mechanisms in place in order to improve the process and to enhance the chances of electoral integrity. I'm sorry I've spoken so much on this issue of electoral integrity, but it is very, very important. The last point I want to make with regards to this is that security agencies need to display professionalism, neutrality, and impartiality in the responsibilities assigned to them during elections. This is very, very important. In fact, in all fairness, the relative success that we had in the 2015 general elections was because of the active engagement of what we call the Interagency Consultative Committee on Election Security and the commitment of the security agencies to do their best under very difficult circumstances. Now, I'm not saying that there are no breaches. In fact, benefit of hindsight, there were many breaches of professionalism and neutrality in the 2015 general elections. But the most important thing is that when you compare the conduct of security agencies in the 2015 elections with what happened, say, in 2007 elections, it was remarkably much, much better and out of this world. So, as the Senate President said, we need to make sure that things in 2019 are much, much better than 2015. And we must avoid a regression in any way possible. So these are the 9 specific areas that I have offered with regards to recommendations in terms of what can be done at the national level, at the state level, at all levels, in order to enhance the prospects of peace building, good democratic governance, and sustainable development. In conclusion, first, given our diversity, which has historically been complicated by mutual suspicions and fears and bedeviled by perennial conflicts, we must nurture and develop the infrastructure for peace, and we must invest massively in peace building and in sustainable development. As one scholar, Lederach, has observed, and I quote, without adequate resources devoted to peace building, explicit preparations, and commitment over time, peace will remain a distant ideal rather than a practical goal, end of quote. That would only undermine the prospects for sustainable development. As things stand now, we don't seem to have invested sufficient energy and resources to domestic peace building, notwithstanding the reputation of our country in sub-regional and continental peacekeeping and peace building. I'm not saying we should reduce that. International commitment is good, but we should devote even more resources internally, because the stronger we are, the more stable we are, the more developed we are likely to be, and the more we will be able in the future to also honor our international commitments and obligations to our neighbors and to the rest of humanity. Second, and finally, I believe that the major challenge, in addition to all the other challenges that we have, the major challenge of our time is on how to make Nigeria more peaceful, just, and inclusive, especially for those most at risk of violence, injustice, and exclusion, and how to embark on solid pathway to sustainable development. And I believe, as I have said repeatedly in this lecture, only good democratic governance can provide the appropriate framework for meeting this challenge on a sustainable basis. But this is not a manna that can fall from heaven, as we all know, while we sit and look. It is a product of concerted, vigorous struggles and activism by all segments of the Nigerian people, but especially vigorous struggles by progressive, patriotic, and democratic forces in our country. God bless the Federal Republic of Nigeria, and thank you very much.
Professor Atahiru Jega.
Another big round of applause.
And during the lecture, Professor Atahiru Jega delved on the concept of peace building, pointing out that it must not be a reactive, but proactive and preventive. He made the following recommendations. He said Nigeria needs to develop capacity in peace building and conflict resolution domestically. Another recommendation is that state governments must establish peace building agencies for proactive resolution of conflict. He also stressed the need for hard work to institutionalize good democratic governance. He stressed the need for peace building and sustainable development are two sides of a coin that must be worked together. He also highlighted the need to intensify the fight against corruption. He advocates the need for beaming searchlight on bribe taking and bribe giving.
Your Excellency, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Right Honorable Yakubu Dogara, the CJN, the Chief Justice of the Federation, Justice Walter Samuel Onogen, the Secretary to the Government of the Federation, Bose Mustafa, Principal Officers of the National Assembly, distinguished senators and members of the National Assembly here present, the head of the Civil Service of the Federation, honorable ministers, permanent secretaries, heads of agencies of government, service chiefs, their guest lecturer, distinguished invited guests, ladies and gentlemen. Your Excellency, permit me on the very behalf of the Chief Organizer, the Secretary to the Government of the Federation, and his organizing committee, to first and foremost say a very big thank you to God Almighty for sparing our lives, for sparing this administration. This is not only a time of celebration for us, not only a Democracy Day celebration as always, but also the third year of Your Excellency's administration. As it is, we're gathered here to reflect on what God has helped us to achieve as a nation. And we want to say a very, very big thank you. That you did not only provide the opportunity or make this possible, but that you're here in person to grace this occasion. Your Excellency, we are grateful. Thank you so very much. May I also thank all principal public and civil sector officers here present, our traditional rulers here present, our clergymen. We want to say a very big thank you for sparing time to be part of this lecture today. We want to thank our invited guests from far and near, across sectors, captains of industry. We've seen quite a number of you here. We want to say a very big thank you. And also to the staff of the Office of the Secretary to the Government of the Federation. We couldn't have achieved this without you. The ushers, the event organizers, name them. Every one of you have put in your best. We want to say a very, very big thank you. And finally, may I thank specially our guest lecturer for today for taking time not only to work with us in the rush to get this done, but to have delivered such a very eloquent lecture. Sir, you have not done any less than we expected. We want to say a very big thank you. And to all guests, ladies and gentlemen, even gentlemen of the press, we couldn't have fulfilled all this without you. Once again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I have the singular honor to invite to the podium the President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, President Muhammadu Buhari. A big round of applause, please.
The Senate President, the Speaker, House of Representatives, members of the National Assembly, Secretary to the Government of the Federation, the Chief Justice of the Federation, members of the Federal Executive Council, senior government functionaries, our royal fathers, the guest speaker, Professor Attahiru Jega, members of the diplomatic corps, distinguished invited guests, ladies and gentlemen. I am happy to join the array of eminent Nigerians present here today as we celebrate the 2018 Nigerian Democracy Day, which marks the third year of this administration, and to reflect on the progress we have made in our democratic journey and governance in the last 3 years. A government elected by the people must continually be in touch with the aspirations of the people and work for their highest possible good. The theme of this year's celebration, peace building and good governance for sustainable development, has been carefully selected to reflect our current opportunities and challenges. We have experienced rough times, but through good governance, we have not allowed ourselves to be overawed by the existence of challenges. Weak governance is often at the core of rising inequality and unequal development, resulting in social disruption and political unrest with negative impacts on growth and development. Accordingly, we have engaged in several rounds of dialogue and town hall meetings targeted at peace building between the aggrieved and in some cases warring factions and the communities. We have worked hard to dialogue with, and if they turn unreasonable, dismiss insurgents in various parts of the country. We are still grappling, but unsuccessfully, with border disputes and restoring the much-needed peaceful coexistence among our people and neighboring countries. The rebuilding of the Northeast is ongoing to return our internally displaced brothers, sisters, and children to their ancestral homes. Our resolve to fight corruption was informed by the realization that the reducing corruption and ensuring the effective and just utilization of public resources are crucial for achieving sustainable growth and development in Nigeria. Corruption has been at the root of most of the development challenges of our country. There can be no progress in any facet of our national life unless we tackle and curb corruption. Good governance is the polar opposite to corruption. Accordingly, we will not relent in our efforts to eliminate it regardless of the opposition. It manifests itself in several forms, including accelerating poverty, conflicts, and civil disturbances, as those who feel shortchanged resort to violence and destruction. The security in the country today has considerably improved against the background of what we met in May 2015. Incidences of bombings in towns and villages have been drastically curtailed. Series of plots have been averted and stopped, and culprits arrested through the vigilance, patriotism, and professionalism of our security agencies. The entire country has been freed from occupation of any of its parts by insurgents. While we grieve with our compatriots who have lost relatives and properties, we are unrelenting in equipping and preparing our troops to confront the agents of violence who have been engaging in banditry and reckless killings in various parts of the country under whatever guise until total victory is achieved. Again, it is pertinent to note that insurgency and terrorism are worldwide phenomena affecting even the best policed nations. Our economy is on the mend. We have achieved a good number of our set objectives, notably increased food production and food security, increased economic diversification into sectors that were hitherto neglected or underexplored. Our foreign reserves have reached new heights, and the outcome in respect of investment in infrastructure expansion are manifest everywhere. Overall, we are on track. I thank all and commend all who have worked so hard with us to achieve these successes. I assure you that our people will continue to see and experience more progress, more prosperity, and greater security. Finally, I call on Nigerians to remain steadfast and keep faith with this administration as we remain committed to peace building and good governance to deliver the best of dividends of democracy to Nigerian people. Here, I must digress to raise an observation by the program's organizers, because I did not see Mr. Urubebe, who ought to have come and listened to Professor Jega delivering this lecture. This is a major observation. That incident, for those of us who are lucky that there was light and we had the television to see the confrontation between Mr. Urubebe and Professor Jega, it will make a life impression as it has made in some of us. The other one is Professor Jega's briefing to the government, the opposition, and the military before the date of the election was finally agreed to. Professor Jega, well, as the professor, it was not surprising, briefed us of his activities between 2011 and 2015, the recruitment, equipping, and the training of INEC officials. That gave us, those of us who are lucky to get the copy of his report, the courage to confront the government that nothing outside the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria will be accepted by the opposition. So the question of an interim administration or postponing election for more than 90 days shouldn't be on the table. And I thank personally and on behalf of this country, the United States government then, under President Obama, by sending John Kerry to read the Rights Acts to the government and to us, the opposition then, that nothing other than a free and fair election is acceptable. Thank you very much.
Mr. President, sir, the photographs, there's a photograph, Mr. President. We're expecting to do a group photograph. Thank you, sir. Thank you. The Senate President is coming on. The Speaker of the House of Representatives is also here. The Secretary of the Government of the Federation. We have VIPs, all ministers. All ministers should please come forth. Thank you very much. Our guest lecturer is also here. This is a public lecture picture. Please, can we take our positions? Please, can we take some seats behind? There's a step behind, please. There's a step behind, sir. Sir, can we? Behind, please. Yes. Move back a little bit so that we can get some coverage. Please, can we move back, please? Move back a little bit. Move back. Move back. Thank you. Please, can we have the national anthem? The national anthem, please.
That was the live telecast of the 2018 Democracy Day Lecture. We now hand you over back to the studio for the continuation of the day's telecast. Thanks for watching. My name is Dele Atumi.
Far away in Ondo State, southwest Nigeria, lies a visible striking feature of the range of mountains with several peaks along the undulating expanse set on the stage with an excellent experience with nature. This natural feature is found in Idare, a sleepy town of about 129,000 people, located beautifully at a valley spanning 1,914 square kilometers. The town can be described as a close, locked up by the heights of the mountains with only one road leading to the town.
Idare, the city itself is full of rocks, boulders, mountains, as you could see around. Our ancestors decided, I don't know when, but can't be less than 800 years ago, to settle on top of the hills. It is not on top of a hill there at all. It is like a plateau surrounded by rocks. And if you go there, you will see that it is so. But up there, it's about 3 miles in diameter, which contained the people at that time. And we had been managing ourselves.
The ancient Idore, what to find in the present, the present, when I say present, I'm talking of the Okeda, which is already is becoming past now, because we are now in a different, Odode here. We are in Alade, we are in Atoshin. See. So he brought us to that place. We settled there. The people still very apprehensive of the crown they hold, and they are being threatened here and there. People are watching where they can snatch, but it was not possible for them. But eventually they came to Okidari. The old palace was built by Bagaju, the person who came as the first Owa of Idari land. And we settled permanently there. It was called us permanently. And we had part of Ileoluji staying there with us there. Part of Ikwetu Jesha, yes, being with us. Part of even Owo staying with us with Idari people. But later, they too, like the usual method, they too pack away later.
These are some natural edifices with intimidating heights of rocks encircle the people of Idare town in a conical order. These rocks with conical shapes are fondly known as Idare Hills and are